Here you are.
Yeah,
Please.
Okay. Thanks a ton, Ali. Let me just share my screen. Let's get this going. Okay, so I want to talk about a little opportunity that's come up with minerals, which gives us all an opportunity to advocate for a citizen's dividend right across the world. So let me just quickly go through the presentation and then we can do some questions later. So the underlying premise is that everybody in the planet actually is an owner of minerals. And this, if you think about it, like, we talk about Alaska as this permanent fund dividend as the great example of universal basic income. The same principle can apply to minerals all over the world, and not just and more specifically where a fund already exists. There is even an opportunity to ask for a dividend to be paid out from that fund, like in Norway or Nigeria. But I'm just going to talk about a specific opportunity that's open right now. So the UNEP, this is the United Nations Environment Program. They have 2 years back, they have a United Nations Environment Assembly that passed a resolution on mineral resource governance. And now they've opened a consultation on this, and that's open till about a month from now. 28th of August is the last date. And they're having a bunch of webinar consultations alongside. You can send in emails, or you can attend these webinars and sort of propose how you think mineral resource governance should happen. So let me just explain how we are thinking about this issue. So the first question is, who actually owns minerals? And this is just a quick summary of how it works. So there is a certain set of global ownership of minerals, which are basically in areas not under any particular state. So the deep oceans, which are beyond territorial boundaries, they are considered the common heritage of mankind. Everybody on the planet has a share in that. Then you have things like Antarctica and the moon and asteroids. And while it sounds strange, but like mining is being predicted on the moon within 5 years. So all of these, everybody on the planet is an owner. Then coming to territorial areas, in most nations, the nation itself is the owner of the minerals. But there are some exceptions, and I'll talk about it. And very specifically, in some countries, especially the US is the big example, the landowner is the owner of the minerals below the land. But when it's in the ocean, it's almost always the nation. Then there's also some variations in certain places, like in India, the state, the sub-national entity is the owner of the minerals. That's true, I know, in Australia and Canada, and probably in other places I don't know about. Again, when there are indigenous people and they have certain kinds of sovereignty rights, they also tend to own minerals. This is again true, US, Canada, India, I know about. And then, of course, we talked about landowners in the US as well as pockets in India. Now, we talked about mineral ownership, but there is another concept in law, and where basically minerals are owned. We are basically inheritors of these minerals because none of us have created minerals. So we have an obligation to ensure our future generations inherit the minerals or their value. And this applies to all the levels above, individual landowners. In UK and common law countries, this is called the public trust doctrine. In civil law countries like most of Europe, it's called public domain. And when we're talking about global sort of deep sea mining and things like that, that's called the common heritage of mankind, or should be called humankind. So we explain this very simply in 5 principles. So let me just quickly explain the core idea. The first principle is that minerals are owned by states on behalf of the people no, minerals are owned by the state as a trustee on behalf of the people and especially future generations. The second principle is that since we have inherited the minerals, we must make sure future generations inherit either the minerals or their value. If we decide to extract the minerals, and this is a choice, if we do decide to extract the minerals, we must make sure we get the full value of the mineral, which is what we can sell the mineral for minus what it costs to extract, including a profit for the extractor. Fourth, whatever we receive from selling our minerals, we must put into a future generations fund, like Norway is the great example, so that future generations will not inherit the minerals, but they inherit the fund instead. And fifth is that since we own the minerals, we own the fund created from the minerals, so we own the income from the fund, distributed equally to everybody as a citizen's dividend or a universal basic income. It may not reach a basic income level, but it would be universal for everybody. So 5 simple principles. States own minerals as trustees. We have to ensure future generations inherit either the minerals or their value. Make sure you get the full value of the mineral. Save everything you receive for future generations. And the income distribute to everybody equally as owners. Future generations inherit the fund and can do the same. So just the 2 big ideas in this. One is the idea of intergenerational equity. What we inherit, we must pass on. The second big idea is when we are extracting minerals, we're effectively converting the mineral into wealth of another time. Now, this is quite important because this is sort of a little bit of an empirical analysis, an optimistic empirical analysis. If we inherited $100 or rupees of minerals, and this is a global analysis based largely on IMF data, straight upfront, 10% is lost to extractors. This is extremely optimistic. The data actually shows that we're probably losing more than half of the value. So what we're getting is 90. Then of that 90, what is happening is most of it is a large chunk is getting consumed. It's being, we get royalties, we call it revenue or a tax, and you spend it. Then what is saved, a good chunk of that itself is wasted. IMF estimates about half of public investment is wasted. So future generations will inherit about maybe $9 or $10 of useful investments, plus financial assets like Norway's fund and things like that, another $31, $32. So basically 100 in the current system is becoming about $40. $60 are being lost to future generations and actually to everybody in common, because we all owned it in common, and some of it has got consumed and some of it has got captured by extractors and rent seekers of various kinds. So if we implement the principles that we are arguing for, basically zero loss, save everything and share everything, we believe it's a massive improvement in the public finance management and from an economic standpoint. The first thing is, because the capital base is not declining, capital is maintained, this is fundamentally a sustainable system. Because if capital is constantly declining, at some point capital becomes zero, and like you have Nauru as a great example. They had phosphates, they took out all the phosphates, they created a fund, they mismanaged the fund. Today they don't have phosphates or money. So this makes the economy sustainable. The second is because we're saving, instead of 40, we're saving 100. There's a higher savings rate in the economy, which will create growth. The fund we're suggesting is invested in low-cost mutual funds like Vanguard Mutual Fund. And when you go into the investment management theory, it's very hard to beat this rate of return. So this will give you a very high rate of return or unbeatable rates of return, not very high necessarily. The fourth is, of course, the citizen dividend is a universal basic income. Everybody will get it at the global level and probably at the national level. The fifth is because not much money is coming into the government. All the money from extraction is going into the fund and then as a dividend. Governments will have to improve the way they, sort of raise taxes and spend the money, because otherwise people will not be willing to spend, pay taxes. This should improve the quality of governance, especially in countries with authoritarian governments and are just wasting money, in building monuments and things like that. Sixth is it reduces the increase in inequality, because if you think what's happened is you started with 100 and now left with 40, which is jointly owned. The remaining 60 has been captured by certain people. You can think of it as a negative basic income. What was owned by everybody has paid a per head tax, and a few people have become rich. So increase in inequality is reduced in this manner. And it's obviously a fair kind of a system. Now, this is not entirely pie in the sky kind of a thing. In India's national mineral policy, we've got two very key statements. I won't read through it, but the first one really encapsulates the first two principles of what I was talking about. The third is that state governments as the owners will try to get zero loss. And we've also, at the national level, through judicial action, got a Goa Iron Ore Permanent Fund intended to be a future generations fund, which is a global precedent. So what's left is the citizens' dividend, which we believe is actually, when you work through the logic, is very obvious and should naturally flow through, though only Alaska actually has such citizens' dividend. Natural resource funds, there are over 50 of them already in the world. Goa is not in the map here, but this was done in 2016. And there's no reason that we cannot go to each one of these funds or to the government controlling them and saying that don't use the income from the fund in your budget, just use this to pay out a citizen's dividend because we're all equal owners. And it's a very straightforward argument to make in any of the countries where something like this exists. And, the money exists, the income exists, just has to change from going to the budget to going to the actual owners of this income. This idea also has analogies with carbon tax plus a future generations fund plus a dividend. Paul Harnett spoke about this 2 or 3 sessions ago. And we have a webinar actually in a couple of days by World Basic Income on this idea of carbon charge going into a fund, because carbon is actually a capital kind of a thing. Carbon stays in the environment for hundreds of years. We're not sure how many hundreds of years, but it stays in the environment for hundreds of years. So it's a little bit of a capital kind of a structure. So there's a carbon charge plus a fund plus a dividend. Similarly, Henry George has this very powerful idea of a land value tax, and Neo Georgists have converted this into a land value tax plus dividend. And in most countries with mobile telephony, the mobile companies are paying the government a spectrum charge for the use of the commons of radio waves, and there's no reason that charge cannot simply be paid out to everybody as a dividend. So in general, this is a structure of a commons. Where it is in capital in nature, you create a fund. Where it is income in nature, you directly pay out the dividend. And the fund, if it's capital in nature, then the income goes out as a dividend. Now let me get into the UNEP consultation. The UNEP has basically started this consultation on mineral resource governance. And Goa Foundation, in the future we need, the Goa Foundation has sent in a detailed representation already. And based on that, we have created a sign-on letter where any of you as organizations or as individuals could sign on, or you could send your own representation. You might have other things to add into this, or reduce some of the things we've asked about. And the information is available here. I'll share the file on the this presentation after this so that you can all have it. The deadline for this is 28th of August. Second, there is a series of webinars, consultation webinars, and the schedule is on the next slide. But if you are joining the webinar, because we'd like the voices from all over the world to make the same demand, so UNEP feels that it's not just Goa Foundation, one entity in one corner of the world asking for this. And the broad idea of what we're asking for, if you can actually read it out aloud on the webinar if you do decide to join the webinar. We'd really appreciate voices from all over the world supporting this. This is the list of consultation webinars. The ones in gray have already happened, unfortunately. North America does not seem to be included, and you can actually, I would suggest writing into UNIP and asking them why North America has not been included. The link at the top will pop up, and you can register for the webinars in your own areas. But there are still going to be regional webinars and then a global webinar. So there are still more, we have more opportunities to influence this entire process. Other than this, we have one other advocacy campaign specifically on deep sea mining, because it looks like mining might start very soon, or the licenses might take place. What's going on is very, very poor, badly structured. It's going to be very small amounts received for our common inheritance, and biodiversity will be damaged. Our main demand is for a moratorium on deep sea mining. But if mining does take place, and it's right now the way it's structured, it's almost impossible to stop it. If it does take place, we do demand that this be dealt with as a global commons, and where we have a global sovereign wealth fund, and the income from the global sovereign wealth fund be paid out, whatever it is, as the global citizens dividend to pretty much everybody on the planet. And for all of you out here, we can also have in-country campaigns, just like we've started in India. There's a campaign going on in Guyana. In Portugal, along with Roberto Merrill, who's also part of this group, we've actually had a letter in an article in one of the leading newspapers out there making this demand. And this can be in any country, we can make this kind of a demand. And it follows a fairly obvious kind of a logic to it. And as I mentioned, any place where there is already a sovereign wealth fund, it's a pretty easy thing to make this demand that we should have this kind of a dividend instead of using the money in the budget. And we're very happy to help if anybody wants to start any of these campaigns in your own countries or your own, sort of more smaller areas, depending on the ownership structure. Who we are, we're Goa Foundation. We're an environmental non-profit in Goa. We've stumbled upon this in our advocacy. We see the applicability across the planet for something like this. The future we need is what we've set up as a global movement to make this idea of intergenerational equity core to everything in civilization, starting with minerals. And these are some of the campaigns we already have. Actually, the UNIP campaign, I should add on to this. And we plan in a longer period a center for implementing intergenerational equity to get into some of the more academic and research-based kinds of things. There's a whole bunch of links on reading and multimedia and things you can do. And if you want to engage with the future we need itself, one is if you start your own campaign, or if you want to work directly with us and help us, we need to be able to communicate this idea in many different ways. And we really need some writers as well as help on the IT side. And over time, we need to convert this into training material so that people on the ground in different countries, UBI already has a large set of stuff, but this is different from UBI in a little way. And there are many other opportunities for various kinds of academic research that will come up. And of course, if you would like to donate, please. So let me just stop here. And I can see there are a whole variety of questions that have come up. So let me just stop sharing my screen, and I guess we can take questions.
Dear Raul, thank you very much. Barb is raising her hand. Dear Barb. Okay.
Yeah, hi, Rahul. Thank you so much for that. And it's really good to see that things are happening around this, and that the UN is taking it seriously. I guess the first thing that came to mind in my mind, I know that there are a lot of struggles going on in the US where Native Americans have managed to stop mineral extraction, through the courts, using the treaties. And I guess my my question is well, how to put this? Could there be some kind of reward for not using the minerals? Okay, if you see what I mean, because that's all, you know, in terms of land, and you know, I always wonder, like, whether, say, like the Alaska Permanent Fund, whether that makes people less likely to join environmental causes. I'm sure you must have thought about this at some point.
Yeah, and so in fact, the US is a very interesting example. Most people don't know that in Alaska, actually, what happened when Alaska became a state is that the state government got a big chunk of land, but actually the native peoples out there also got a big chunk of land, and they set up Alaskan native corporations. There are 17 sort of regional ones, and there are some over 100 village level corporations who actually own these rights to the subsoil minerals. And one of the biggest advocates for further extraction in Alaska is the biggest Alaskan Native Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you have these conflicts. On the other side, you have the Cree Nation, in, I forget which state it is, who instead of extracting minerals, they built a casino, and the income from the casino they pay out as a dividend. This is a very good example of a universal basic income from a different kind of a source. Our basic principle is that future generations have to inherit either the minerals or its value. Okay. And when you think about it, the question is, can you ensure that you get the full value of the mineral and save that value in a fund or some other way in perpetuity? And I'm guessing a lot of people will say, you know, maybe that's a lot harder than just leaving it in the ground, because it's much harder to steal minerals when it is in the ground than when it's as a fund, because you've got all these, you know, Bernie Madoff and all these other crazy guys trying to separate a rich person from their wealth. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people will say that, you know, it's safer in the ground. But I think we need to let people decide it for themselves rather than prescribing it.
Sure. I just was wondering, like, what the kind of incentive would be, like, you know, like as with the indigenous population in Alaska who is trying to get their minerals extracted. Again, it's just like two really huge cases were just won in the US based on treaties, which, you know, one stopped a pipeline and then the other gave about a third of Oklahoma to the tribe that it should have been with all this time. Okay. So it's just, yeah. So, yeah, no, it's just an interesting question that, I mean, we can't finish the discussion now. But.
Let me just give you one more example. IMF did a recent study on Norway, where basically what's happened is the income from the fund going into the budget has resulted in over promises on pensions and, you know, government expenses in the future. And the IMF has estimated that Norway requires a 4% fiscal consolidation just to ensure that the government, which has a positive net worth today, ends up at a zero net worth. Oh. And if they have to maintain the net worth at what they are today, they have to have a 10% of GDP fiscal consolidation. So everybody thinks Norway has done a great job, but if Norway has to just stay as wealthy as they are today, they have to reduce expenses from the government to the extent of 10% of GDP. And that's because they don't see what's going on. When they realize what's going on, it's a very different picture. So, I mean, it's something that you have to work through a little bit through the analysis.
Okay, well, I look forward to getting the presentation and having a closer look at it. Thank you.
Reinhard, please.
Yes, thank you. I have a very similar question to Barb, because I'm a bit concerned that this analysis is very much from an economic perspective, and I don't think that you can ever predict future use of minerals or other resources. So ideally, I mean, obviously that is the ideal situation. You would not like to use any of them because you cannot predict what, for instance, petrol or other minerals will be used in the future. I mean, the most extreme, it's not a mineral example, but a species example. Economically, it makes sense to turn animals and plant species into money, because if you calculate it based on the sort of return on the money, the dividend, you probably get a higher return than the reproductive rate of the animals or the plant species. But I think that cannot be what we are aiming for. And I think it's quite similar with mineral resources. We don't know what the future use could be. So I don't know. I mean, it's probably a dilemma which cannot be resolved, but just as a concern.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely, it's a concern worth raising. But at the end of the day, we can't stop using minerals today. I mean, we're all using minerals just to be on this Zoom call. So, and if that mineral gets extracted, then this is what we think should happen. But sure enough, if you don't extract the mineral, you've also met intergenerational equity, and that's absolutely fine.
Thank you, Rahul. And also John Mills. Dear John, you're here.
Thanks, Ali. My biggest concern, living in Canada, we've got the oil sands. In order to rehabilitate the mess that extracting that oil has created is going to cost an absolute enormous amount of time and horrendous amounts of money. And I think that, even before we distribute the proceeds sort of thing, we have to make sure that the extraction process ends up at the bottom end as clean as can be. And that's something that I think hasn't been addressed properly ever.
Yeah. No, I haven't got into the entire structure out here, John, because, we have looked at we are an environmental NGO, so we look very hard at the environment. If you get into sort of the larger statements, it's all there. Let me respond. Let me just explain how we're looking at the environment. We're saying that first you need to set aside no-go areas. So oil sands actually should have been a no-go area in the first place. It's just a ridiculous kind of a thing to be extracting. Then you have to, area-wise caps. Again, I know in the oil sands you have multiple mines, and then it's hard to pinpoint who's responsible and things like that. So you need to have overall, area-wise environmental caps. Then you have to, under the precautionary principle, also limit it based on things like, in the Netherlands, over-extraction of gas has led to land subsidence and earthquakes. Again, you have to have limits on that. And then you get into the polluter pay thing side, where you want to say you want to avoid. If you cannot avoid, you want to mitigate. If you can't mitigate, you want to offset, and then finally you pay money. So that's one set of things. The second set of things I should just mention is when we say zero loss, if you think about what's happened in Alberta, is basically you all have got peanuts for the oil sands from the oil companies, and that money has been spent. It's been frittered away. So what you started off in Alberta was with pristine land with oil sands. What you've now got is a mess, and no oil, and the future generations basically have a cleanup bill. If you think as a trustee, the responsibility of a trustee, which all of us are, is to make good any loss. So to your point, if we get some money from the oil in future, we have to use that first to clean up and to make good any other loss. Then it goes into the fund. And if there's any income from the fund, again, that goes first towards making good any loss. And only after that is any income distributable.
Dear Rahul?
Yeah.
Okay, here you are. Dear Rahul, I guess you mentioned about this, but will you going to be sharing your presentation? If you think it's a possibility, you can send to the email group so that our friends can utilize it. Because I understand that you modified your original presentation and you made a presentation from UBI perspective. So it is an original one, I guess.
Yeah, I made this specifically for this thing, and I will share it on the email. I've already shared it on the group.
That's great. That will be great. Any other friends?
I see Ingun has raised a hand. Bob has also.
They are congratulating you. Just clapping.
Oh, thanks. But please sign up. I mean, it's important. This is a global bit of advocacy, and it will be really good to get a global demand for citizens' dividend. We need to get this idea into everybody's head. It's just a different way to get at it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rahul. When you first wrote about this issue, it was maybe not directly related to the UBI, but now it is much more connected to the UBI discussions. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. So no more